Hello everybody and welcome back to the Kart Racer game development series. So the plan for today is to go through some of the basics of using Unity, and soon after that we're going to continue on using Unity in order to get our car working in a game environment, maybe put some controls in there. I think I'll probably split that up into a few different videos. First I just wanted to point out that here is our GitHub page. So you can see github.com experiments in CS/kartracer with a K. And inside this Git repository we have the model exported in both formats and also the reference image that I showed you in previous video. And in in the Kart Racer folder, this is actually the Unity project that we made last time. It's just really basic, and that's what we're going to be starting with today. So pause the video and make sure you get this Kart Racer repository if you don't want to use the one that you developed last time. Alright, so continuing on, this is our project right here. I'm just going to open this up. I think a new version of Unity came out a few days ago, but that's something that's not going to make a really big difference in our development. I probably will switch to it eventually. But in the meantime, if you just want to stick with the version that you've got, I'm sure it should do just fine. So again, the goal for this particular video is just to go through a tour of some of the features of Unity. I'll show you how to get around. I'll show you the different parts, how to reconfigure the interface, and how scripting might work. So in my machine, I had installed Unity and also I had installed Visual Studio. And in the video where I showed you how to download and install all of that stuff, you should have been able to follow along with that process. It is absolutely possible to set it up with other development environments, but in this example I'm going to use Visual Studio. That's what I like. Alright, so this is our project from last time, our car, which honestly doesn't look very nice with these particular materials. Anyway, just an example object for us to look at while I give you the quick tour. So first let me show you around the interface. So you can see up at the top we've got some quick controls. So you can see I'm going to show you some of the mouse-based controls for doing some of these things a little bit later. But for example, if you click on this and we left click and drag, you can see it'll just sort of pan around. We've got a move tool, a rotate tool, a scale tool, and so on that we can use. So up here we've got some basic controls. And here we've got our hierarchy view. These are the objects that are actually in our scene. So we have a scene right now called sample scene. You can divide up your game into multiple scenes. These might be different levels. You might have a menu scene. You might have a configuration screen. But anyway, we have these this basic hierarchy here, and you can see that it is a true hierarchy. We can have objects within objects. So when we imported our cart, you can see that it imported one object, but inside that there are a number of child objects, including the axles, the wheels, and so on. And you can select all of these individually. You can see that it kind of highlights over here as you click on them. It'll show you which ones are selected. And it's got a whole bunch of properties for it over here, and this is called the inspector view. The inspector view is where you're going to make changes. So for example, if I wanted to resize this wheel, I could go in here and actually type in some values rather than use these values. These are just values that happen to come from Blender. I could have reset the transforms in Blender so that this would come out as just scaled in 1, 1, 1, not rotated. But in this case, I wanted it to. I didn't really mind that much. We will be making a few adjustments to our car in the next video, but for now I think this is actually quite alright. So that's the hierarchy view and the inspector view. I also have a few windows shown here. I don't think on your machine necessarily you'll see all of these. You might not see the asset store. So let me actually close that one. I'm just going to right click on the tab and close it. I have a scene view and a game view. So the scene view is actually where I look around at my objects. I'm going to move around. I'm actually going to create things. I want to create a terrain. I want to create a building. I want to import my objects and manipulate them, resize them, rotate them. That kind of stuff. I'm going to do that in the scene view. You can see there's lots of modifiers here, so I can change this. I can go into 2D view if I want to, or I can stay in 3D view. You can see when it's not highlighted, even though it says 2D, it's a little bit confusing. That means that we're in 3D mode. Okay, we can change this shaded mode, although I pretty much never do that. And we also have these gizmos that show up, and these are pretty much very, very similar to the ones that showed up in Blender. So you can see this is a transform, so we can actually do a translation on a per axis basis. We can also rotate our camera. Again, we can line it up with a specific axis, and I can also do orthogonal and perspective mode cameras by switching and clicking on this. And so for example, from orthogonal mode, here we go, as viewed from this angle, viewed from this angle, viewed from this angle. So this is actually a really nice, convenient way of looking around. So that's our scene view. Our game view is very similar actually, except that it's always going to show based on the current view of the camera. Now by default, when you open up a new project in Unity, you always have a camera. And so if I go back to scene view here, and I double click on the camera, if you double click on an object, it'll bring you pretty close to that object. And I can move the camera just like I can any other object. It's got a transform, as you can see here. I can move that around. And right now I'm currently in top view, so let's actually look at this car from the front. And you can see that it gives us a little camera preview. That's only because we have the camera selected. If I select something else, you can see that it doesn't show the camera view. And that might not be enough. It might not be, I don't know if I can see all the details that I want to see. So you can switch over to game mode, which is basically, this is exactly what you're going to see when you first start the game. Okay, so that's the purpose. Scene mode is where you're going to spend most of your time, but I will just say that you can actually view the game mode, and you can make changes to your game as the game plays. So let me actually show you what I mean. If you want to reconfigure your display, by the way, you can just drag any of these and just drag them into a new position. So I'm going to drag it right here, so then I kind of have a side-by-side view, and I'll move the car here so I can see the car in both views. And in this view over here, I can actually play the game. I'll show you some more details about this a little later. I can play the game, and then as I move the camera around, for example, you can see it'll update in real time. I can also modify the car. So for example, if I want to scale this car in the x-axis, you can see that it's going to scale. And I'll see this happening in real time, which might be useful if I'm currently doing some simulations. It just Control-Z, by the way, to undo that. It might be really useful if I'm currently doing some simulations. So for example, my car is driving, I want to kind of see it from different angles. Maybe I want to view, for example, I want to look around and see if there's any objects coming up that I'm going to crash into, or maybe I can click on the car and over here adjust some of the properties of the vehicle as the car is moving. So maybe, for example, we want to change the power of the wheels when we accelerate. Those are all kinds of possibilities that we can do. Alright, so let's stop the game here. And I'm going to, again, put these together because I need a nice big window here for my scene view. That's what I really like. And so the hierarchy are the actual objects that are currently in the scene. Now, on the other hand, the project view, which I usually leave in its default position down here, the project view are all the objects that I can put in my scene. So we've got our basic cart that we imported last time. We just dragged it in here. We had a simple script that we worked on last time. And we've got our scenes, which is our one scene that we have. And we've got our materials that were imported from the cart. And these are all those. So let's quickly, I'm going to make this a little bit less metallic, maybe. And there we go. So anyway. So we've got all of our objects in here. We can create things called prefabs, which basically are ready-made objects. So I might create a prefab for this cart so that I can have an AI character will have the same cart and my player character can have the same cart. So I can reuse the same object over and over again. And of course, scripts are where we're going to put our code. So this is where we're going to basically put everything that we're going to need in the entire game. So usually it's a really good idea to keep this nice and organized. We're going to have some folders, a folder structure, and so on. So you can see I've kind of started that here with materials and scenes. Didn't put this script into a folder at all, and same here. So if I have things like meshes, I want to reorganize this whole thing. So I have folders for meshes, folders for textures, folders for materials, folders for animations, etc. Okay, and then one last window to show. These are the main ones. There's actually quite a few more. Is the console window. And the console window is where we're going to see output from our scripts. This is what we're going to do while we're debugging. So while the game is playing, we'll actually see the script output in here. There's a couple of options in here that you can do. You can actually turn on or off certain kinds of messages. So for example, these are errors. You usually want to see errors. If there's some kind of an error, usually your game will fail to play. And these will be warnings. You usually want to keep those turned on as well. And these will just be regular debug messages. I usually keep them all turned on because I want to see all of them. Usually the debug messages are actually generated by me. And then another thing you might want to turn on is this collapse. So for example, if you have something going on in your game loop that's going to happen every single frame of the game, then you're going to see hundreds and hundreds of messages being output. Collapse will actually make it so that all of those, if they have the exact same text, for example, it says what the current speed is, so you just want to output what the current speed is so you can check to see why your car is not moving properly. Is you can output the speed, and if the speed remains the same, you're not going to see another message, and they're not going to all scroll past, so you can't see them all if you have collapse enabled. If you turn off collapse, then you'll be able to see the individual messages. You can also clear it and so on. You can also set clear on play, which I usually do. I don't want to see the messages from last time I played, so I usually keep these two on. Okay, you can also pause when an error occurs. I usually don't bother with that. Usually when an error happens, I usually want to stop and edit the script, fix whatever the error is, and then start the game again. Alright, so that's the tour of the window. If you ever want to open up one of these that you accidentally closed, so you saw that, that asset store one, you just go to the window here, and then you should actually be able to repick. So some of them are organized in different ways. You can see there's actually quite a few more that are not normally available. So for example, I can create a navigation window so that I can maybe have some AI cars that will drive around the scene. I want to open up the navigation window, but they're closed by default. Okay, so first of all, let's figure out how to move around in this scene view. So the first thing we might want to do is do a pan. I mentioned that we've got this button right here. We can do that, so we can actually manually click on that if we want to. And then we can just drag around with the left mouse button and dragging the mouse. And that's a pretty useful thing if I want to like kind of put something in the center of the window. That might be really helpful. Or I don't even need to be in this mode. I can just use the middle mouse button or the scroll wheel, and then I can drag around. So regardless of what mode I'm in. So for example, I'll switch to this mode and I'll use the middle mouse button and I'll drag around. You can see it does exactly the same thing. So for me, it doesn't really make any sense to use that because it's easy, accessible, and you're always going to have the mouse available anyway. So the next thing you might want to do is use look mode. And so that's going to be the right mouse button, and then you drag the mouse around. You see, we'll be able to look around the scene. And this also enables fly-through mode. That's what it's called in Unity. And you can use the WASD keys to move around. So while I'm holding the right button, I can drag the mouse around to look at it from different angles, but I can also use WASD keys in order to zoom in and out. You can see in that case I was a little too close to the car and I started obscuring some of the geometry of the car. But you know, you can see you can move around with the WASD keys, and that's another way that you can navigate around. So that's pretty handy. So that's fly-through mode. You can also zoom in and out. So for example, if you use the scroll wheel, you can zoom in and out. So for example, you're combining this with the look around mode, and then we can zoom in, and I might want to put this in the center of the view. Then you know, I can get a closer look at something, like my terrible geometry here. Another thing you might want to do is orbit mode, which is a little different than look around, because look around basically means that I'm going to be looking in different directions. If I hold down the Alt button and I use the left button, then what I'm doing is I'm sort of orbiting around the center of my current view. So for example, if I double click on my cart, I'll put the cart in the center of the view. Now I hold down the Alt button and I drag with the left button. Actually, I'm just rotating around this object that's currently centered. Alright, another thing that's really important is you'll notice that Unity will actually turn on these little widgets. They're called Gizmos. You can see up here, you can turn them on or off. But in this case, for example, because I selected this object and I'm currently in translate mode, that's what this is, and I can actually use this to move the object around. You actually will find as you add different objects or different components to those objects, there'll be a whole bunch of stuff added to the scene here. So not just the fact that the object is currently selected and therefore highlighted in blue, not just the fact that we are currently in translate mode and therefore I can I can use these handles to move it around. There's widgets for all sorts of different purposes. So we'll see quite a few of those in the next video when we basically rig up this car so that we can start driving it around. There's also rotate mode, Anyway, so you can do that. As I mentioned, you can just type in the rotation over here. I'll do Control Z to erase that, but basically you can type in a value. So for example, I want to rotate this 90 degrees. I can just start typing in 90 degrees, hit enter, there we go, done. And I'll just Control Z to do that. If you don't know the specific value and just want to kind of tweak it, so for example, for our camera, let's actually take a look at our camera here. So now what I might do is, again, I'm in rotate mode here, so this is actually be a lot simpler if I just use this to rotate the camera around. But you can also just click on the actual label of any of these values and modify them. So for example, in this case, I'm going to click on the Y, and you can see now I can rotate it. So if I just want to adjust something kind of a fine-tuned way, that's a possibility as well. Okay, let's change that back to 0. All right, so that's basically moving around. So now let's just talk a little bit about how Unity works. So this is a scene, and these are all game objects. You may notice that even some things that you wouldn't think of as game objects, like obviously the cart's going to be an object in our game, but a light and a camera as well, those are also game objects. You notice up here that we've got this transform section in our inspector. This is called a component. And there's another component called a camera, and another component called an audio listener. And a main camera has that because you're going to be acting as a camera, and therefore you're going to need to be able to set, the parameters of our camera. So, if you get too close, it'll be too close to the near plane. We'll start trimming up some of the geometry. So something that's really, really close to the camera doesn't block. For example, if we're right up against a wall, we'll just see through the wall because we'll have this near plane that'll say things that are too close, don't even bother to render those. And we also have a far plane, we might say things that are too far, don't even bother to render those. So these are all the parameters. Field of view, of course, will be kind of like the fisheye versus telephoto kind of lens. And you can change the background and so on. We get kind of an ugly looking default background here. Anyway, so this is another component, and it's specific to the camera. You might have multiple cameras in your scene, but basically only your cameras are going to have this kind of component. You can also always collapse these components if you don't care about them right now. The reason why this main camera also has an audio listener is because it's going to pick up any of the 3D audio that's happening in the scene. So you need to know where it is, so it's attached to an object that actually has a position somewhere in the scene. Similarly, a light also has a transform. You'll notice that every single object in Unity also has a transform. But we also have this light component, and the light component determines exactly how it's going to behave. So for example, a directional light is something that just creates parallel light coming from the same direction, but basically everywhere at once. So it's going to illuminate the entire scene. So you notice what happens. Let's take a quick look here. I'm just going to right click and turn around here. Let's rotate our light using around the y-axis. You'll see here that it rotates around, and you'll see how the illumination of our car updates as a result of it. Okay. Another thing I wanted to point out is that we can, when we do this rotation over here, we are doing a rotation in global. Okay, so this is the global rotation. But if you look up here, so for example, I'm just going to kind of zoom in on our object here. You can see that these controls are kind of tilted. They're not oriented exactly with our global controls. These are our global axes. But up here we can switch it so that they are. So if I click on this, you can see it switches to global mode, and you'll see that this blue semicircle here actually goes around the Z-axis, and similarly the green semicircle goes around the green axis, the Y-axis, and the red semicircle, which just kind of looks like a line from this perspective, it goes around the X-axis. Okay, so we can switch that to global mode if we want to, or we can rotate it with respect to its own coordinates. One of the things we might want to do that for instance, would be our left front wheel, or any wheel really. Let's double click on that, and I'm just going to take a quick peek from a different angle. So looking at this object, if we put it in local mode, I can now look at this and say this is clearly, it needs to be rotated on its blue axis. But you'll notice that the blue axis of the entire scene heads in this direction, and so it would be kind of rotated this way, which is not at all what we're doing. This axis, because it's in local mode, is rotating a completely different way. So in this case, if I rotate this on the Z local axis, you can see that it's like rotating the wheel. Okay, which we might want to do if we want to make it look like this car is moving. Similarly, we might want to rotate in the x-axis if we want to steer. So that's what we would use if I want to figure out how this is going to work. I'm probably going to do this using code, but just for a sense of what kind of rotation is going to be involved, I might want to go into this mode and do this local rotation. So oftentimes you'll switch back and forth between local and global depending on what it is that you want to do. Alright, so I mentioned about the different assets down here, but I didn't talk about the asset store, so I do want to just quickly show you about the asset store. So we're creating a really low poly, kind of low fidelity object here, but I'm going to open up the asset store, going to the window, selecting asset store. It takes a little while to load because this is basically a website that's loading inside a web browser. And if you log in with your account, then this will show things that you have already purchased, but it doesn't matter if you have a subscription or anything, or you're paying for a paid license. There are lots of things that are actually free. So you can actually search by pricing here. You can say, okay, I just want to look for free assets right now. And you can scroll through, and this will show you all the free assets. A lot of stuff provided by Unity itself. So you can see actually some built-in cars. These cars are going to make our car look a lot pretty bad actually in comparison. So there's cars, and there's also a player, and there's also like a person, and there's also an aircraft that if we want to, we could load these in and try them out. They even have scripts and stuff like that, so you can try them. So I would strongly recommend, if you're new to Unity, give that a quick check. Here's a cute little game assets for a platforming game. There's tons of those, but of course you can search. So for example, let's say I'm not satisfied with my car. So what I can do is I can look for car. Just do a quick search. And that's going to find all of the car objects. And let's just look for free assets in that category as well. So there we go. So we can look at some of these cars. You can see these are all free to download and install. And when I do that, I don't know, let's just pick one of these to install. Let's click this one right here. It actually looks like multiple cars, so maybe this was a bad choice because it's going to be pretty sizable. Let's go back. Just want to pick kind of one car. Yeah, sedan car. Sounds pretty good. So when I click on it, then I can click on download. That's going to download it to my local computer. And then it's going to give me the option. It shouldn't be too long to download. It's only 14 megabytes. Even 14 megabytes is taking a long time on my computer. And now I can click on import, which is actually going to bring it into this game specifically. So when I click on import, I'll probably end up deleting this. It'll then say, okay, well, here's all the stuff that actually exists as part of this package. So you can see we can even get the original blend file if we want to. It'll include everything, all the materials, and so on. If this is a huge pack, like those standard assets I was showing you before, then you might want to go through and select specifically the things that you want, because these can get very big very quickly. But anyway, let's import this. This one's not so big. Click on import, and it'll create a new folder. All of these asset store packages are going to create a new folder. So there's one called sedan. Not the best name. You can rename that. But then if I want to, I can go into the prefabs folder here, and I can drag this into my game. Let's take a look in scene view mode. Double click on it so we can get there. Probably very different in size. And there we go, there's our sedan. Obviously we need to fix some materials and stuff for the windows because that doesn't look so great. But anyway, there we go. We've got ourselves a car. And it's got a whole bunch of different objects. They're all called cube for some strange reason. Even the wheels are called cube. But anyway, it's a pretty cool model. It looks decent. Anyway, so that's how that goes. I'm going to delete that though. So you can just select and hit the delete button if you want to do that. So that's something called a prefab. And actually, if you look in the hierarchy mode, you'll see that our cart is also a prefab. And that's just because whenever you import something that's like a package, it kind of considers that. So sort of think of like a prefab as being a whole bunch of stuff put together. So we might have a car, we might have all the control scripts, we might have a whole bunch of stuff that together makes up that car. Same thing here for this sedan. So these are all things that I might want to reuse in different situations. So I might want to tweak some of the parameters, I might want to add some of my own scripts to it, but I basically want to reuse that component exactly as it is. So that's something that you can keep in mind. You can make any object into a prefab if you want to. So for example, I'm going to go into the hierarchy view here. I'm going to right click and create 3D object cube. And nobody's ever thought of inventing a cube before, so I've just developed this amazing new object. And now I want to add this down here into my assets folder. I'm going to drag this cube down here, and now I've just created a prefab. You can see that the object in the scene now turns blue. And I can just drag this cube into a scene and make more copies of it. Okay, now they're all in the same spot. They're all exactly the same size, so it's really hard to notice anything, but anyway, we'll delete all of these. Actually, let's just delete these two. If I select this cube now, I can make changes to it. So for example, I want to change the X scaling. So let's make that not a cube anymore. And so now we've got this prism shape. And this prism shape is not the cube, so it's not the prefab. So if I actually drag this cube in again, you see that it drags in a normal prefab. Let's kind of drag it so it's not inside. There we go. Okay, so anyway, there is our cube. And so if I actually want to make those changes, so I have this X scale and this object up here, I can actually go up here and do these overrides. So overrides are basically means I've made changes to the prefab. So they're not actually part of the prefab, they're specific to this instance. So what I can do then is I can click revert all, which is going to basically make this object identical to the original prefab. In other words, it's going to make it a cube. Or I can click apply all, which is going to make all future cubes have this X transform. So let's do that so that all of these overrides are applied. So I click apply all, and now our cube down here, you can see that it looks a little different. And if I create another cube, you can see that it also has the same transform. So there we go. We got some shadows coming from weird shadows coming from our car here, but anyway, you can see. Let's select both of these objects, and maybe we can just kind of move them away from our. Oops. Let's actually just double click, move them away so we can see a little better. We also did something weird with the lighting, so it's really bright lighting on some sides. Okay, anyway, so that's basically the idea behind prefabs. Finally, I just want to talk about what you do in order to run your game in Unity. I'm just going to delete these two objects. Select them both, hit the delete key, and I'll also delete this prefab because that's not going to be part of our game. So I just have to select that. You can hit delete, that'll delete a prefab. Obviously, be careful with what you delete here. So we've got a cart, and let's put this auto rotator script. We worked on this once before. I'm just going to drag this on the basic cart tutorial object here. That's an auto rotator. I'm going to open this up in Visual Studio so we can see how that works. I'm just going to double click on that. After a couple seconds, that opens it up in Visual Studio. We can see the code that we worked on when we developed that script. Pretty simple, one line of code. It said transform.rotate. And basically we're just going to rotate it a tiny little bit, 0.1 on the y-axis. So going back to Unity, that's basically going to, if we double click on this, that's going to do this kind of rotation. Okay. Alright, so let's click on play. And there we go, there's our auto rotator. So we can just check out our car from different angles. Yeah, whatever. Okay. So, one more thing I'm just going to quickly show you in a script. Oops, that's not over there. In a script, you can always have some output. So, we'll talk a little bit more about scripting later, but for right now, we have these two functions. We have the start function and we have the update function. The update function is called every single frame. So if you have 100 frames a second, this is going to be called 100 times a second. So this is going to happen a lot. If I put a print statement down here, then I'm going to get a lot of print statements in my output. I guess we'll do it, but you could also do a print statement up here. So I'm just going to do debug.log, and then I'll type in a message. Let's just say update called. And this is going to be the same every single time. So assuming that I have collapse turned on in the console, when I run this game, it's going to just show 1 with a little counter beside how many times it happened. So anyway, after a quick second, you can see that Unity compiled that script and it's ready to go. I click on play. and you can see we get all these output here. I don't have collapse turned on, so you can see it's just printing out new lines. If I click on collapse, then it just shows me how many times. So you can see we've got 2,000 of these output lines here. So obviously you want to disable that because it's actually really inefficient to print stuff out to the console. Oops, sorry. So I don't really want that. Let's move this up to the start function, which is only called once when I first click the start. And I should probably change this so that it says start called. And let's just see what's different about that. Again, I have clear on play, so when I click on play, after a second, I'm going to wait for this to compile. And I click on play, and it's going to call start called, and you can see it only gets called one time. Alright, so that's basically the idea. Now remember, even while the game is playing, it's possible for me to make changes. So even though we're driving around, we can make any kind of changes we want to our object. So there's a whole bunch of cool things that we can do with that. It makes it actually really, really easy to use. Alright, so that's it for this video. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to properly import this object, and we've kind of already put it into our project in a really basic way, but I'm going to get all the objects ready so that we can start to script it. So I'm going to create a video where we just get all the objects ready, put all the proper components in there, and I'll introduce a couple of Unity components, and then in the video after that we're going to do the actual scripting that allows us to drive our car around. Alright, so anyway, in the meantime, I hope everybody has been working on their Blender models. I had proposed in the description of, and I think maybe at the end of the last video, that you make your own model, maybe make a slightly different cart, and post a video or an image or something like that to Twitter using the hashtag #ExperimentsInCS. I really would like to see some people's work and see how that's going. I'm happy to retweet if you want to show people your work to a wider audience. Not that I'm a huge Twitter user or anything, but anyhow. I would really like to see that. That would be good for me, help me to feel a little bit more engaged with you guys. Anyway, so I'll see you in the next video.